Welcome to Grace Fellowship Baptist Church Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, March 28th, 2024. We're in the book of 1 Kings. We're in chapter 16 and verse 29. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel, and he reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than did all the kings of Israel before him. So we now have the worst king of Israel presented, but he also ends up being a bigger part of the story than any of the kings other than King David, because of what he does and what he represents. And he is son of Omri, and he marries this woman that in English we know as Jezebel. Her name is actually Isabel. The Bible translators knew that, and we know that today. It was definitely known, though, when the scholars under King James were translating it. And they're the ones that invented this word Jezebel, because King James of England, their sponsor, the one that was paying their salaries to translate into English, was trying to make a treaty with Spain, who was ruled by Queen Isabel. And she had sponsored translators to translate the Bible into Spanish, so her people would know the Bible. And King James was sponsoring people to translate the Bible into English, so his people would know the Bible. At the point in time, they were the only copy of the Bible either one of them had available to them was in Latin. And Latin was a very rare language. There were people who spoke it, but not commonly in England, not commonly in Spain. And the ones that did tended to be in monasteries or in universities, and the common man didn't get a hold of them. So if they had a Bible and it was read in public, people couldn't understand. And both monarchs were trying to get their people to understand Scripture better. Queen Isabel, the Spanish and the English had been enemies for centuries and had been in some sort of low-grade conflict. And it was beginning to be in both of their interest to cooperate on the world scene and not let other powers rise up around them. And King James particularly thought it was in his interest to make a treaty with the Queen of Spain. And they presented him with a rough draft in which they translated the Queen of Israel's name, Ahab's wife, correctly as Isabel, and, making Isabel the villain of a story while you're trying to make a treaty with somebody named Isabel King James thought was just bad politics. And he flatly told him, "You're not going to translate it as Isabel. You do something else. Find a different word. Find a different way to do it." And this caused quite a bit of consternation among the translators. And they finally settled on inventing a word by mistranslating it, transposing it, and doing it through multiple languages to get it back into English so it didn't sound like Isabel. And they ended up with Jezebel. And this was done for political reasons. The interesting thing is, Queen Isabel, with her translation that she authorized Isabel. In Spanish, they knew that Isabel was a queenly name. They could tell this was a godly queen that they ruled under, and this, in the story, was an immoral queen. And she thought they could handle that. She probably would have been amused at the contrivance that King James was going to not offend her. Ultimately, there was not a treaty made between King James and Queen Isabel. In the short term, this seemed to benefit the Spanish. It probably ultimately led to the collapse of their empire, because it meant that King James had to start sponsoring more of a navy, because he was concerned about a naval invasion of his island. And he knew there was lots of places you can invade England, that he did not have enough land forces to repel them. The only way to stop a navy was with a navy. And therefore it led him to start getting people to build a navy for England. And ultimately led to England being the large naval power in the world, not Spain. So, and when the British defeated the Spanish, it started shifting the world power and signaled the decline of Spain and the rise of England, which they maintained their dominant power in the world basically to World War II. They began to decline some at World War I, but so a long, long history there. Jezebel, she was Sidonian. Ahab married her for political reasons, made a treaty with the Sidonians. The king of Sidonia is Ethbaal. By the way, Baal, the word that we very often in English pronounce Baal, it was the very, very old word for God in most of the Semitic languages. In very ancient times, before the Israelite language developed out of the common pool of Semitic languages, El and Baal were equivalent words. And Baal meant the active form of God, the one who did things, who presented himself to the world. And El was the term for the almighty power. And most Semitic languages preferred Baal, and Israel, the Israelites, preferred El. Now, up until the time of the judges in Israel, they used both terms for God. And we have some evidence in language particularly, but also in some archaeological evidence, that up until the time of Samuel, they tended to use Baal to refer to Yahweh. It fell out of favor as the worship of the pagan foreign god Baal entered Israel. And that makes sense if it's entering from another Semitic language. As the thing is, apparently originally the Semitic people, when they were worshiping Baal, were worshiping the one true God that we know as Yahweh. And they understood he was one God. And as they lost focus on the one God, the one true God, as he did not speak to them and their prophets, and they started worshiping however they felt like, and did not keep to the traditions of their fathers, who apparently were monotheistic and understood that Baal was one God, and he'd created it all, and he was all powerful, and he made it all, and they started worshiping however they wanted to. Things started to slowly deteriorate. One of the first steps in that process, they decided that Baal needed an idol so they could visualize who he was, and they selected a bull. And Baal worship, you were supposed to sacrifice a bull. Sheep were not acceptable, goats were not acceptable, other animals were not acceptable. Doves and pigeons and turtle doves and things like that were not acceptable. Only a bull. They quickly settled on the idol needed to be gold. If they didn't select gold, they selected brass and coated it with a vegetable resin to keep it from corroding and getting a patina. It was supposed to look like gold. And they tended to pick a brass that was brighter and shinier and looked more like gold than, most brass. And they coated it with vegetable wax coating so that it preserved it better. That, of course, is not a real successful technique. A lot of the brass bowls that we found then were later heated up and coated in gold leaf. In other words, as they got, they found that even vegetable wax coated brass didn't look like gold long enough. And so they then started to coat it in gold. But if you put the gold on top of the vegetable wax, the gold would peel off. So they learned to heat it in the fire hot enough to burn off the vegetable wax. But then you'd have to immediately polish the brass again and then coat it with gold. And Baal worship quickly centered on worshiping a golden bull, sacrificing bulls to it, and then later in the hands of some of the peoples around the Semitic peoples, they decided that a single God by himself didn't make sense, that he had to have a consort. They determined he would not have a wife, that God would not marry, that on the other hand, he would have a consort. The first generation of that, his consort apparently was a human woman, but very quickly they determined that a human would not be appropriate consort to a god, so she became a god. And there shows you how ideas develop. Now, in the first iteration of this, his consort was just this nebulous idea, but she got the name Asherah. It was a decently common name at the time in Semitic languages. And the same name in Hebrew is Esther, by the way. So, we're talking a common Hebrew name. Same, like Queen Esther in the Bible. That the Persian also had that same name. It's interesting. But the women, as it developed, the women worshipped Asherah, the men worshipped Baal. And Baal became the god of fire, the god of agriculture, of agricultural productivity, not fertility in the sense of bearing children or animals bearing lots of young. That got put onto Asherah. And so Baal produced crops in the field, made animals strong and healthy. Baal was also the one that sent fire from heaven to consume things, caused wildfires. He was the one that caused fires and hearths to stay lit. Without his active involvement, your hearth fire went out. It was, things like that. He was also viewed as a god of lightning, but not thunder. And that they viewed lightning as fire in the sky. They kind of understood that lightning occasionally caused wildfire, and that therefore lightning out of the sky was Baal lighting the earth on fire from the heaven. He was independent of the sun and the moon and the stars in the heaven. He originally was creator of the earth and the sun and moon and stars in the heavens. Later, as they accept more gods into their pantheon, they have a sun god and a moon god and star gods and etc. And accepts an underworld god, and you know, we don't know fully about all of those as Baal worship gets wiped out in the Middle East. We lose a lot of records, and there was a lot of vengeance and intentional burning of records. And the Israelites were not the only ones that did that, by the way. The Babylonians did it, the Assyrians did it, the Syrians did it, the Armenians did it somewhat, the Persians did it, the Medes did it, the Elamites did it. So there's a bunch of different groups, and a lot of them are trying to wipe out Baal worship. All of them viewed it as some sort of heresy. And exactly what kind of heresy it was depends upon which group it was trying to work it out. If they were naturally polytheistic, they viewed Baal as the all-powerful God, as a single God, a monotheistic, and viewed that as heretical. He may have a consort, but she doesn't do anything that he doesn't do, kind of how they viewed it. And he's just kind of the feminine side of him, which is the way some cultures taught Baal and Asherah, is they were the male and female sides of God, and they were one God. Then other gods split them into two distinct gods and two distinct personalities, and that's the kind of thing. The bull symbol and a lot of the ritual that was associated with Baal worship, as it entered Europe, particularly with the Celtic people, they shaped it into something a little different, and the Celts kept it. And when Roman Catholicism tried to suppress the Celtic religion, it became Satan worship. So Baal worship has not totally been wiped out in this world. It's changed form, it's changed history, but a lot of the symbols are still there. And they're continuous from apparently Abraham's time to the present in certain forms. Ethbaal, the king of Sidon, he is his name honors this god, and he was named that to honor the god, and to therefore have that god be a protector for him. His daughter, Jezebel, whichever name you want to call her, is, like a lot of royal daughters, married off to a nearby king as part of a treaty. Now, if that sounds familiar, Tyre was the original capital of Sidon. Hiram, king of Tyre, had one of his daughters marry Solomon. And by the way, Solomon built a temple to Baal for his wife. So Ahab, making a treaty with Ethbaal, the king of Sidon, he's doing what historically the Israelites had done under Solomon. He's imitating Solomon. And he builds a temple to Baal. and to Asherah. Now, that's the interesting thing, and the thing that the ancient Israelites would have been like, oh, he did what? Asherah was a religion for women. It was not a religion for men. Women did all of the prep and all of the sacrifices and all of the stuff for Asherah, and they did it, and it was generally with food that they cooked. Loaves of bread were shaped, etc., etc., and different kinds of rituals were done. Other than the Asherah pole, which was out in public, and they did things around. And by the way, the modern equivalent of the Asherah pole is a simplified version, but in England it's called the maypole. And the native religion of the Britons that used it, they had ribbons that they attached to the top, and then they did this community dance that wound them around it and weaved them together, and they covered the pole in the ribbons, and that was part of their religious worship. And they left it basically till the cloth rotted off, and then when it started looking ratty, then the priest got out there and ripped it all down, and then they did it again the next May, 1st of May. But that was apparently a bastardized version of how the women decorated their Asherah poles. And I've talked about how the Asherah poles were public symbols of human sexuality, were very pornographic. They were also made of wood, and they were carved by hand and left out in the public view. They were very often the equivalent of painted and decorated, which helped preserve them some, and being erect helps preserve them some. But they very often decayed and had to be remade. And it's fairly common for every community about once a generation to go renew their Asherah pole. And so when you hear about them being cut down and burned, Baal, his idol was made out of gold, or if you were cheap, brass. His altar was made out of stone. The altar for Asherah was very often dirt or clay. And, it had to be basically rebuilt every time it rained. Much different idea of permanence there. Consequently, what an Asherah pole looked like changed very rapidly through history as fashions came and went. Some descriptions have said they were phallic symbols. Some have said they were the female equivalent. Apparently, at different points in time, they were different things. But the commonality was they glorified human sexuality as a religious experience. And the common thing of the worship of Asherah was you had sex in public. Not necessarily with your spouse. So Ahab setting one up, instead of the women in his kingdom setting it up, says something about him. And a lot of the people in his day and time would have thought he was a very effeminate man. They would have questioned whether he was masculine enough to produce children, etc. They would have, and because of that, he had to defend his manhood, be a very aggressive monarch. So when God says that he was worse than all the monarchs before him, all the other kings before him, he participated in the sons of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. He worshipped the golden calves, blah, blah, blah. He let the people worship at every high hill, green hill. He introduced foreign gods into Israel, specifically. And after having intentionally supported the female god that was only worshipped by women and made an Asherah pole, he had to be hyper-masculine and militaristic and an absolute tyrant and abuse the people. This is the Ahab we're dealing with. And he did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel, Yahweh, than anybody else. In fact, he's going to be so bad that there's only going to be one other king ever mentioned in Kings that rivals his reputation for evil. All the others are better than him, except one. Verse 34. In Ahab's time, Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho. He laid its foundations at the cost of his firstborn son, Abraham, and he set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, in accordance with the word of the Lord spoken by Joshua, son of Nun. So, during Ahab's time, Jericho gets rebuilt. And the implication is Ahab was basically encouraging this and paying for it and wanting to set up a city that was controlled by Israel that would control the eastern border of Judah. And so Jericho was rebuilt. And Hiel, from Bethel, is the man that led that effort. And as Joshua foretold, prophesied, the man that did it would lose his firstborn as he set the foundation and his youngest son as he set up the gates. And they're telling that Joshua's prophecy came true. So they're showing here that Joshua was a prophet of God and that you have to pay attention to what he told you. And one of the things he told you to do was worship Yahweh and Yahweh only. What a contrast. And this Hiel, we know nothing else about him other than the name of his oldest and youngest sons, and that he rebuilt Jericho and lost his sons in the process. Almighty Father, you are an awesome and mighty God. I ask that we not be like Ahab, not prostitute ourselves to all the other things that we could be worshiping, that we focus on you and the proper worship of you. We don't invent gods. We don't import gods. We don't turn our eyes to other gods. That we would be pure before you. That we would leave well enough alone. If you say to leave it unbuilt, we would not rebuild it like rebuilding Jericho. But thank you that you showed that Joshua knew what he was talking about. That he learned it from you. That he proclaimed it because you told him to. And that when people who did not respect you did it anyway, it came about exactly as you said. Lord, help us to realize that and to live our lives for you, no matter how hard it gets. In your almighty name, amen. I am your host, Frank Reich, Associate Pastor of Family and Ministry at Grace Fellowship Baptist Church. And this has been the Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, March 28th, 2024. This was recorded on Monday, March 25th, 2024. And I hope to see you Wednesday night at Bible study. Oscar did a masterful job yesterday with his Palm Sunday sermon. I look forward to his Good Friday sermon and his Easter sermon. And I know Bill has an exquisite worship service planned both for Good Friday and Easter. I urge you to be there Friday. I hope to see you there Friday. I urge you to be there Sunday. You should worship God and understand God better. And I hope you commit completely to God the way that Bill and Oscar are setting this up to teach you to do. Y'all have a blessed week.